Let's kick off the second episode of Baptist Orthodoxy. As I mentioned last time, I wanted to move into history for this one. And coming out of deciding that unity was an issue and that it needed to be fixed, I ended up trying to decide, okay, so where do I go from here? My decision was I got to look back at history. When was the church actually together? What did they believe? So that was my target area. So I started from two points. I went back and I was trying to find the earliest writers that I could of the early church, post apostles. And number two was backtracking history through the history of the church in order to find the point where things went askew, right? And I figured I could kind of meet in the middle somewhere. So I started reading some of that reading. We'll go ahead and I'm going to tackle some of that next time. But really, just going backward, I started finding things that were of significance that really made me decide that the East was where I wanted to concentrate my attention. Number one was going back to the 1500s. Now, that's the Protestant Reformation. I was aware that, hey, somewhere in the 1500s, thought maybe 1600s, I didn't know the exact date, was the Protestant Reformation, with Luther putting up his 95 Theses and then things going from there. Then, and I had heard of the Great Schism, right? The Great Schism was the breaking of the church. And that was right around the turn of the first millennium. Right around 1000. So I thought I'd go ahead and check out those exact dates. And then it turns out Luther went ahead and hammered up his 95 Theses in 1517, and the Great Schism was 1054. So when you go ahead and you look at these things, now first of all, if you continue tracing it back and you get back to 1054 and you look at it and go, oh, well, this is where Rome broke away. Now then, this was the big thing with me on the schism. I thought the schism was an actual separation of basically the church splitting in half, but it wasn't. And so once I realized this wasn't the church splitting in half type thing, and so I wanted to look at that a little closer, but it meant that what happened in 1517 was by far less important until I figured out what actually happened in 1054. Now then, when you look at it, the churches, once the split did happen in 1054, and I'll go over that here in a moment, but once it happened, they tried a couple different times to come back together. Some of the readings that I did suggest that you really didn't have a final end to this whole Catholic, Eastern, or I shouldn't even say Catholic, Roman Catholic, or Roman and Eastern Orthodox attempt to get back together until 1437, which is the Council of Florence, when the Byzantine emperor, for lack of a better phrase, came begging to the West to say, hey, give me some help because I'm beset by all these Ottoman Turks and such, and they're about to overrun Byzantium. And the church essentially taking advantage of that to say, oh, well, if you guys will agree to all these things, which was everything they got booted out of the church for, out of communion with the East for, then we'll give you some help. And so the patriarch dies before the whole council's over. The Constantinople, patriarch from Constantinople dies. And so he doesn't sign anything. The emperor goes ahead and kind of takes over for the East on negotiations and says, oh yeah, we'll sign off on all those. And essentially does. It goes back. There's one of the bishops who's with him, and only one, Mark of Ephesus, says, no, that's not orthodoxy. That's not right. We're not doing that. And so then it gets back, and he basically goes on his own little crusade, Mark does, to rally the church against these doctrines that the emperor just signed on their behalf. And so yet the church basically doesn't accept the Council of Florence, and they punt that one back. Not that it matters too much, because the Roman Church was slow to get support and get it over there, and Constantinople falls, and the whole reason the Eastern Emperor was working and kind of giving himself over to the West, that whole reason falls apart anyway. But it still stands that 1054 is the recognized date, and that they were separate. So why were they separate? There's a couple different reasons. One is the Pope had started trying to claim primacy amongst all the patriarchs. And so that you understand, the church prior to that 1054 split was made up of 5 major regions, if you will. And each of those regions were controlled by different individuals. And so they were the patriarchs. So you had your patriarchates, or whatever you want to call them. But so they were the big bishops, also referred to as metropolitans, although I think metropolitan is a term that comes into vogue later. And we had the bishop in Rome, you had the bishop in Alexandria, Jerusalem, Constantinople, and Antioch. So we had 5. Of those 5, the bishop in Rome started claiming primacy amongst all the others. Not just primacy of honor, but primacy of authority, and being able to claim to boss everybody around. Well, there was no real precedent for that. If you look back at the ecumenical councils, now ecumenical councils are ones in which all of the major patriarchs, signed off on it, and basically said, yeah, this is good to go. They had representation from across the empire at the time, but across all the areas where the church was, because once you have your east-west split, particularly after the West collapses in around 500 AD, you still have some councils that happen after that, all the way up into the 700s, that are considered some of the 7 ecumenical councils. Note that if you are Catholic, or if you're more familiar with, and I say Catholic, but Catholic means worldwide, if you are Roman Catholic, or if you are more familiar with the Roman Catholic Church, there's more than 7 ecumenical councils. But prior to 1054, there were only 7 from the actual church itself when it was together. And those are the ones that I would count. So when you look at those, and you go back to the first one, well, in there they talk about the Alexandrian, I believe it's the Alexandrian patriarch, was going to have the same authority over his region that the Roman bishop has over his region. And some have argued that that shows that Rome had primacy. Don't see how that one's supposed to work, because they're comparing Alexandria's patriarch's authority to that of the Roman pontiff. So unless they were making Alexandria, putting them in charge of everything, which they weren't. Therefore, that shows that the bishop in Rome pretty much had the same authority as the bishop in Alexandria. And he doesn't mention the other guys. In the second ecumenical council, it talks about place of honor. And it says that the bishop of Constantinople will have the position of honor second only to the bishop of Rome. Again, it doesn't mention anything about authority or anything. It's a matter of honor. And it seems like where that came from was originally with the Roman emperor sitting in Rome. The bishop sitting in Rome had the primacy of honor because he was co-located with the emperor. Then it moved, right? The Roman emperor, the seat of the Roman emperor, moved east to Constantinople. And when it did that, then they decided to go ahead and mention that, but still they didn't take away that primacy of honor of Rome, probably because he was the first. But they say that Constantinople is now second only to Rome in honor. Okay, so neither of those places do they mention anything about authority. But by the time you get up to 1054, the bishop in Rome is trying to claim primacy of authority over the other patriarchs, and they're not going for it. Number 2 is the filioque. The filioque is means and the son, and what it was an addition to the Constantinopolitan Nicene Creed, or the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. When you look at it, what this thing, so this is the creed many Christian groups follow, the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, right? It talks about the Trinity, it talks about the oneness of Jesus with God, and them being of the same essence along with the Holy Spirit. But also in there, it has the original one talks about, after they go ahead and modify it. So the Nicene Creed goes ahead and lays it out. They had to deal with another heresy, and so when they have the Council of Constantinople, they go ahead and add a couple bullets into it. And what they end up with is a creed that's not supposed to be changed, right? Unless you do it by worldwide, church-wide council. And in there, it says that that Jesus is the only begotten, and then when it gets down to the Holy Spirit, it mentions that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father, and together with the Father and the Son are worshipped and glorified. And this filioque changes it so that instead of proceeds from the Father, it is proceeds from the Father and the Son, and together with the Father and Son are worshipped and glorified. Not to get into, there could be a whole episode probably talking about how that was viewed as a major issue. But suffice to say, the Eastern Church viewed that as a major error, if not a heresy. But that notwithstanding, it was changed by a local synod that was held in Spain when they added the filioque, apparently trying to fight off or beat back some other misunderstanding, and they put that in. And then it becomes kind of common knowledge over with the Franks and stuff like that, if you're familiar with the Western development. So you got Charlemagne and those over there in France, and they picked this thing up, and they're running with it. Now then, so the bishop in Rome is aware of it, but he's also aware that it's not part of the actual Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, and therefore doesn't add it in. Not until, I forgot, it's the 700s or 800s, when it really starts raising its head and popping up in places. And so the Eastern patriarchs keep on pushing back against it. One of the bishops in Rome goes ahead and actually has the original Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed written in, I forgot if it was stone or metal, on St. Peter's Basilica, so that, so you're not going to be getting changes to it. And he denounces the actual, this filioque as being improper. And so the real issue is that you're not supposed to change it without having a big council, right? And so I guess you could have come together, and the whole church could have had this discussion, and maybe they would have changed it. I highly doubt it. But the fact of the matter is, they didn't. It came up in this regional synod, and eventually the bishop in Rome just goes with it, uses it in mass, and separates himself essentially from the rest of the church as far as what they believe and what they hold. So now you have this primacy issue going on now, and then you have the filioque being an issue. So those are probably the two big ones. Now, then, admitted, if you look at 1054, and I ran into one individual who was poking fun at it and said, this is ridiculous. It's the whole problem during 1054 was over the Roman Church using unleavened bread for the Eucharist. Well, this is true. The 1054 dust up, when you start looking at it, was you had churches in Constantinople who held allegiance to the bishop in Rome, and they were doing their Eucharist in unleavened bread. None of the Eastern patriarchs approved of that. The bishop in Rome did. And then the Constantinople patriarch tells the churches that are there in his city, you cannot do this. You must use leavened bread. They didn't listen. There's a whole row over the whole thing. Bottom line is, there's a big blow up. Some attitudes get involved between, some of the Roman legates who are involved and the Constantinopolitan, or the bishop in Constantinople. But the whole reason they can't come back together is it really boils down to this whole filioque and supposed primacy of the bishop in Rome. And these are issues that started like in the 800s. They continue up to 1054. And that is the main issue. Say, like I mentioned, Florence, when they come back from the Council of Florence, Mark of Ephesus is not going, these people who use unleavened bread for the Eucharist are wanting us to go ahead and bend the knee to them. No, that wasn't his issue. It was this whole, by then, the Roman Church had also moved forward with the infallibility of the Pope. So you had infallibility of the Pope, which was a problem. You had supremacy of the Pope, authority-wise, amongst the other patriarchs, is a problem. And you had filioque, which was seen as a heresy. Once I found that out, I was like, okay, first of all, I had one bishop out of 5 across all the patriarchates who decided that he wanted to do things differently and essentially separated himself from the others. So that left 4. So that told me that we had these 4 patriarchs of the original church that were still there. Now, it turns out after the Council of Chalcedon, which was an earlier split, there was a group of churches which started in Antioch and kind of spread, I believe, into Syria and stuff like that, which pulled some churches away and some of the North African churches, and you ended up with the Oriental Orthodox. Again, not to get into the reasons why, but it was a few churches that split off, and they disagreed with the Council of Chalcedon, which was dealing with a Christological heresy, and they did not feel that it was handled the correct way. And but all the rest of the West, to include the Roman Church, the Roman Catholics after it, Protestants after them, hold to the Council of Chalcedon. So in looking at the Oriental Orthodox, I was like, okay, I don't think they were the continuation of the original church. I believe those 4 patriarchs who continued the church after Rome separated are the remnant of the actual church. And what did they do? So when you go ahead and you follow history and stuff, it ties in. They get dominated because of the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Ottoman Turks roll in, Persians roll in at different times. And so they're dealing with, they fall under Persian control for quite some time. And so they just have a lot of issues. At the same time, you have the West gets an opportunity to grow, and they are protected from the growth of the Muslim Empire. And so you see a lot of growth in the Western Church and the Western nations that you don't see in the East. But still, the church keeps going. Later on, after they come out from underneath that, they get assistance from the Russian Tsar and end up creating a patriarchate up there. More patriarchs have been created since then to represent the various regions where the churches are. Now, it really boiled down to me for, in looking at it, is do those four churches that grew into Eastern Orthodox Church that we refer to today, is the Eastern Orthodox Church still practicing the way they did back then? Because historically, again, in summary, historically, you had the one Christian church, after spreading, was managed in 5 regions. Each of those 5 regions were controlled by a patriarch who sat in Jerusalem, Rome, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Antioch. One of those bishops decided that they wanted things their way and they wanted to control. The other 4 said no. So then the one separated himself from the 4, or from the 5. It's, stepped out of the 5. So now there was 1 in the West, 4 in the East. And then the East ended up continuing to develop. The West, which had already, in theory, separated from the other churches in some beliefs with that filioque and the primacy of the Pope, continued to come up with various innovations, which I believe led to that another schism in 1517, known as the Reformation, right? And I believe that happened because the Roman Church was making some changes that they shouldn't have been making, and it was recognized. And there's various things that could have, should have happened. If they had been able to contact the East and potentially had those Lutheran bishops actually move up underneath the East, and then the East could have taken control of some of those churches moving west, although that probably would have caused a war, as sad as that would be. But they didn't. They split off, which caused all sorts of, splintering, and which I think is horrible as well. I really wish the church could have come together. And I wish it could come together today, but not in this ecumenical idea that ecumenism, or however it's supposed to be pronounced, the way a lot of people look at it is we just need to ignore our differences and come together because we all love Christ. And I don't think that's accurate either, right? There are certain practices that were done in the early church. There were certain beliefs from the early church which are tied in with the Bible, and but it's the interpretations of the church that really are significant. And so that's what I feel like we need to get back to. So I would love to see all the churches come back to the East, because I think that's the church who has maintained those beliefs, because they give honor to those saints who went ahead and wrote those books. A lot of that early writing, whether it's, the letters by Ignatius, the letter from Clement, First Clement. And, you can just go through several of them. And the East, that's where I went next, right? So I decided the East is where it's supposed to be. I started looking at the writings. I mentioned it at the very beginning. And I want to touch on some of the writings, but I'm going to break it up into various issues that I was looking for. Because the question is, are they currently practicing the way that they did then? So it was, well, they got this thing going on, which is different from my little Protestant upbringing, in some cases very different. Some of those things being the fact that the Eucharist, right, the communion, is a real and effectual thing. That is the actual body and blood of Christ, and not just a symbol. That baptism is an actual effectual event, and it's not just for show. The the veneration of saints and the veneration of Mary. That seemed to be a bit of an issue for me and my wife. Those are some of the big ones. And so I want to go into it piece by piece. I'm going to take some of the easy ones first and go through those. But there were some definite things that my wife and I were looking at going, well, the Eastern Church believes this. And so for me, it was, well, did the early church believe this? And if it did, then apparently I was wrong. If the early church didn't believe this, then the Eastern Church isn't the place that I need to be. And so far, as I've checked various things, the Eastern Church believes what the early church believed, which believed what the apostles passed to them, and ties in with the Bible. So hopefully we can go through these pieces, show you how I can show you how they tie in, is how early I found some of these things, and and if nothing else, you can see where I landed. You can decide where you want to land. Again, for me, it's the Eastern Orthodox Church, but I want to talk through several of the issues that Protestants may have, because, again, Baptist Orthodoxy. Coming from a Baptist background and looking at some of these things, I was like, I don't know about that. But I did have an open mind, and I was willing to learn, or to have a teachable spirit, so that if I found it in historical documents where the church actually believed what the current Eastern Church believed, then I was willing to go ahead and make those changes, because I feel the historical church, when it was together, right, prior to 1054, is the church that we need to try to get back to. So there we are. That's it. I'm going to touch on some, more detailed history, particularly of these issues, for next time. Hope everybody found that interesting, and hopefully I don't ramble too much.